Alright, so I need to talk about something that's been sitting with me all morning, and I'm not going to ease you into it gently, because frankly, it doesn't deserve a gentle introduction. There's a letter. An official, documented, league-issued letter that landed and essentially ended a young man's football dreams before they ever properly began. And the more I've sat with it, the more I keep going back and forth between thinking this is the NFL finally showing some backbone and thinking this is one of the most strategically convenient moral stands a billion-dollar organization has ever taken. I'm going to walk you through all of it, because there are layers here that the quick headlines are missing completely, and some of this is going to make you genuinely uncomfortable, regardless of which side you land on. Let's start with Brendan Sorsby, and let's start with the reality of where he is right now. Not suspended, not sidelined temporarily. Done. The NFL sent him a letter confirming there will be no supplemental draft this year, which means the one narrow pathway he had left into professional football has been sealed shut. No college eligibility remaining, no draft slot waiting, no roster spot holding his name. Just a talented quarterback standing at a door that was just bolted from the inside with no clear way to force it open before next year at the absolute earliest. That's where this ends up. That's the destination. But how we got here is the part that actually matters. A few weeks before that letter arrived, the situation was already deteriorating in very public ways. The Big 12 Conference had moved toward legal action against Texas Tech, and Sorsby's name kept appearing throughout that process in ways that weren't flattering. Then Shedeur Sanders said something on record that I remember stopping on when I first heard it. He looked straight into the camera and essentially asked why any program, any coach, any organization would want a player on their roster who had been gambling against his own team. No hedging, no diplomatic cushioning, just that question, hanging there. At the time, I treated it as one coach's opinion, a blunt one, but still just a perspective. What I didn't fully appreciate yet was that Sanders wasn't speaking just for himself. He was articulating something the entire league had already quietly decided. Sorsby submitted a formal petition to the NFL on June 16th, requesting special eligibility consideration for a supplemental draft. And the response that came back wasn't some bureaucratic form letter with a soft rejection at the bottom. It was deliberate, structured, almost surgical in how it dismantled every angle of his argument before he even had a chance to make it properly. I've gone through the substance of that letter carefully, and I want to walk you through the key pieces, because the language the league chose tells you everything about how seriously they wanted this door to stay shut. The league opened by establishing jurisdiction. Under the collective bargaining agreement, the commissioner's office holds complete discretion over whether a supplemental draft even takes place in a given year. They hadn't run one in years. And critically, before Sorsby's petition hit their desk, they had absolutely no intention of running one now, because no other eligible player had even submitted a request. Read that again and let it sit. The implicit message right there is already pointed. You're not asking to participate in something that was going to happen anyway. You're trying to manufacture an opportunity specifically for yourself, and we want you to understand that distinction very clearly before we continue. Then the letter sharpened considerably. They noted that the petition arrived only 3 business days before the procedural deadline. No supporting documentation, no substantive explanation of circumstances. And here's the detail that I think actually stung the most when you read the full context. Sorsby had only submitted this petition after already abandoning his own legal challenge against the NCAA's sanctions. Think about that timeline for a moment, because the sequence is genuinely damning. He goes to court to fight the ruling. Something happens. Either he loses ground, runs out of realistic options, or decides the fight isn't winnable. And only after walking away from that legal battle does he turn around and ask the NFL to essentially become his escape route. The league read that sequence perfectly, and they were not sympathetic to it. Their position was essentially, you dropped one fight when it got hard, and now you expect us to hand you a different door. We don't work that way. But then comes the section of the letter that carries the most weight, the part with actual teeth. The league laid out, in plain language, what the NCAA had documented in its findings against him. A permanent bar from college athletics, not a suspension with a defined end date, not a multi-year exclusion with reinstatement conditions. Permanent. And the basis for that ruling was described as a sustained, recurring pattern of improper gambling activity that stretched across his time at 3 separate programs, 3 schools, multiple seasons, multiple environments where he had the chance to recognize what was happening and stop it, and didn't. When you break down the specific conduct that was reported, it gets progressively harder to frame this as anything other than what it was. Wagers placed on his own team, bets placed on games involving his own teammates, people whose careers and livelihoods were directly connected to every snap he took, and to keep his own name off the transaction records, he allegedly used other people's identities and accounts to route the money. I want you to understand what that last part means, because it's the most important element in all of this. That's not impulse. That's not a bad night or a weak moment or a single catastrophic decision. That's a constructed system. A deliberate architecture built to keep the money flowing while maintaining personal distance from the paper trail. That's someone who understood exactly what they were doing was wrong and chose to keep doing it anyway, carefully enough to avoid detection. And there are also references in the broader reporting to potential violations of state criminal law sitting underneath all of it. What made the league's response even more pointed was what they observed about Sorsby's petition itself. Through all of that documented conduct, through all of those findings, his submission to the league addressed essentially none of it. No acknowledgement, no accountability, no articulation of what specifically would be different going forward if they opened this door for him. Instead of confronting what happened directly, his approach appeared to be to simply try to move past it through legal maneuvering and only redirect toward the NFL once the legal options dried up. The league found that insufficient. More than insufficient, they found it disqualifying. They closed the letter with the familiar Goodell language about the privilege of competing in this league and the responsibility that comes with it, acknowledged that Sorsby has real talent, and pointed him toward the 2027 draft as the next potential opportunity. The moment that letter became public, reactions came fast. Adam Schefter's read on it was clear and, I think, accurate. This wasn't purely about Sorsby as an individual. The league used this moment to send a broader message. Whatever happened in your previous football life, whatever conduct was documented before you came through our doors, you address it before you arrive, not after. You don't get to outrun the record by changing the jurisdiction. And when I went back and thought about the months leading up to this, something clicked that I'd been missing. Every time league insiders were pressed about the supplemental draft over the past several months, the answers were evasive. Vague references to the commissioner's authority, non-committal timelines. Nobody would give a straight answer about when or whether it would happen. I originally chalked that up to typical NFL bureaucratic opacity. Looking back now, that hesitation wasn't vagueness for its own sake. They already knew where this was going. They were just waiting for the right moment to close it officially. Now here's the part of this conversation that I genuinely struggled with, and I think anyone engaging honestly with this story has to sit with it too. The NFL generated enormous revenue from gambling partnerships last year. Betting app advertisements run during live game broadcasts. Odds integrations are built directly into broadcast graphics. The league has embedded sports wagering into the fan experience at nearly every level of consumption. And yet here they are, drawing what they're calling an absolute ethical line the moment a player's name appears in the same sentence as gambling, even when the NCAA itself noted there was no finding of an in-game integrity violation tied to his specific wagers. The league is not interested in making that distinction. If the word and the name connect at any level, that's sufficient. They wanted a clean, unambiguous outcome, and they engineered one by simply declining to hold the draft at all. I heard one radio host put this tension about as bluntly as it can be put. He said the league sits on billions of dollars in gambling revenue every single season and then turns around and positions itself as the guardian of integrity the moment a player gets caught up in wagering. That's a real contradiction, and I don't think we serve anyone by smoothing over it just because the headline sounds decisive. He wasn't letting Sorsby off the hook either. He made clear that the conduct, if accurately reported, was serious and repeated and not some isolated lapse in judgment. But his core point was this: A powerful organization making an example of one individual doesn't automatically become principled just because that individual made genuine mistakes. You can hold both of those truths at the same time. Sorsby's conduct appears to have been genuinely serious, documented across multiple programs and multiple seasons, and the league that just shut him out profits substantially from the same ecosystem they're now citing as the reason he can't enter their building. Both things are true. I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because one version of the story is cleaner. So where does Sorsby actually go from here? Some insiders have raised the possibility of additional legal action, but the realistic leverage is nearly non-existent. There's no supplemental draft to challenge in court. There's no roster spot being withheld that he can point to as unlawful exclusion. The opportunity simply doesn't exist in a form he can contest. He waits, he prepares, he either demonstrates something different over the next calendar year or he doesn't. And time, which was already working against him, keeps moving regardless. That's the weight of where he stands right now, and no amount of media positioning changes the arithmetic of it. Now, while all of that was unfolding, something else was happening in Cleveland that had a completely different energy, but carried its own kind of frustration, and I want to give it the space it deserves because it got buried somewhat under the Sorsby coverage. Trade rumors about Shedeur Sanders before a single preseason snap, before training camp had even reached full intensity. Reports were circulating, labeled speculative but spreading with the velocity of reported fact, connecting Shedeur's name to teams like the Jets, the Dolphins, the Cardinals, and the Buccaneers as potential destinations if Cleveland decided to move him for the right return. When this hit the airwaves, the reaction from former players who've actually been inside that ecosystem was something to witness. One former Browns defensive back couldn't even get through his initial response without the frustration cracking through his voice. The sentiment was direct and hard to argue with. We've watched this quarterback develop. We've seen real growth, real measurable improvement in how he's operating and processing the game. We haven't seen him take a single preseason snap yet, and the conversation has already shifted to packaging him in a trade, before he's proven anything conclusively, before he's failed anything either. The discussion is skipping the entire process that would give us actual information and jumping straight to transaction speculation. And then someone in that conversation raised a question that genuinely stopped the room for a moment because it reframed the entire dynamic. What if the timing of these rumors isn't coincidental? What if the fact that Shedeur has been improving, that he's generating legitimate buzz about pushing for the starting role, is precisely why the trade speculation started surfacing now? Because here's how this business actually operates. A quarterback with rising stock is worth dramatically more on the trade market than one who's buried on a depth chart going nowhere. If a front office is quietly entertaining the idea of moving on, you don't float that when the player is struggling and has no leverage. You float it when everyone's starting to believe in him. You maximize the return at peak perceived value. That theory landed differently than most of what was being said that day. The response was somewhere between disbelief and refusal, an almost visceral rejection of the premise. The hope expressed was that it was noise, off-season dead air filling the gaps between now and when real football actually starts and gives everyone something substantive to talk about. But the question had been asked, and it didn't disappear cleanly. There was also a broader point raised that I think deserves more attention than it typically gets. Nobody is running this volume of speculation about any other position group on that roster. You don't hear a constant drumbeat of trade rumor cycles about receivers or edge rushers. The quarterback position gets treated as permanent content fuel in a way that no other position does, because the stakes attached to it are so high that any whisper about it becomes instantly amplified. A roster decision at quarterback isn't just a personnel move. It's a referendum on the entire direction of a franchise, which means even baseless speculation gets treated with the gravity of reported news. Then came the hypothetical that sharpened everything. Imagine a Cleveland front office executive picking up the phone to another team and pitching Shedeur Sanders for a second-round pick, maybe a first. The immediate answer to that scenario was flat refusal, not conditional, not dependent on circumstances, just no. And I understand that reaction completely, because it reflects something real about how this player should be valued. Shedeur Sanders came into this draft as a first-round talent. His evaluation hasn't changed. He's not a depth piece you flip for draft capital because the room got crowded. He's not a reclamation project someone else might like better in a different system. He's a player you drafted with intention. And there's another layer that I think gets lost in these conversations too quickly. The Browns' head coach has reportedly wanted Shedeur Sanders on his roster for years. Not months, years. That's not the kind of investment you discard the moment off-season roster management gets complicated. When someone has been building toward landing a specific player at a specific position for that length of time, you don't ship him out before he's even had a real opportunity to show what he can do under game conditions. The infrastructure of belief that surrounds Shedeur in that building is not nothing, and the trade speculation feels disconnected from that reality in ways the reporting doesn't fully acknowledge. So, where does all of this leave us really? Sorsby's situation feels, if not completely final, then as close to final as anything in professional sports gets before a definitive legal resolution. The NFL closed that door with precision and intention, and there's no obvious mechanism left for him to force it back open before the 2027 draft cycle. Whether you read their decision as principled or self-serving probably depends on your tolerance for organizations that profit enormously from an ecosystem while simultaneously using that ecosystem as justification for exclusion. I don't think one reading cancels the other. I think both are accurate, and the discomfort of holding them together is part of what makes this story genuinely complicated, rather than clean. In Cleveland, the quarterback room drama shows no sign of quieting down. Shedeur's development on the field is generating exactly the kind of momentum that makes certain people nervous, the kind that gets converted into trade speculation before anyone has even watched him perform in a meaningful game. Whether that speculation reflects anything real happening inside the organization or whether it's just content filling the dead air of a slow offseason, we won't know until camp opens fully and the conversation has actual football to anchor it. Two different quarterbacks, two completely different circumstances, but the same thing running underneath both stories. In this league, perception accelerates faster than evidence ever can, and the loudest narratives are almost always the ones with the least amount of actual football behind them yet. That's the part that stays with me longest when I put both of these stories down and try to figure out what they actually mean.